Disruptive FM is brought to you by Branding Strategy Insider. Read all about branding in the 21st century and how to adapt in an era of disruption. Check out brandingstrategyinsider.com. If you've ever gotten into a strategic conversation, do you lay out a concrete agenda? Step 1, Step 2, Step 3, Step 4. Or do you imagine multiple scenarios?
What if?
Disruptive FM, the marketing podcast for eccentric minds. Hey, wait a minute. Isn't Disruptive FM an oxymoron? What is so disruptive about frequency modulation in the first place? Well, a lot, actually, if we reimagine its purpose. Disruptive FM was started on the concept of thinking more imaginatively about marketing. What does it mean beyond all the silly buzzwords?
Growth hack,
and how do we connect more with people?
on investment.
It's humans, after all, that we're trying to reach until the arrival of our robot overlords. This is Disruptive FM, the marketing podcast for eccentric minds. Co-hosted by myself, Jeffrey Colon, a senior marketing communications designer at Microsoft.
Disrupt the system, jam the transmission.
And Cheryl Metzger, strategy director at Wirestone. Both of us proud Ogilvy alumni. Don't think of this podcast as us talking at you. Rather, us talking with you. Let's begin the dialogue. This is Disruptive FM, the marketing podcast for eccentric minds. I'm your co-host, Jeffrey Colon.
And I'm Cheryl Metzger.
Hey, I thought you were maybe not there for a second and got upset with me and didn't want to show up to the podcast.
No, I just wanted you to be on your toes.
Oh, excellent. Well, it's an important thing to stay on your toes. We don't want to fear of missing out of anything because that might lead to, I don't know, just maybe not being part of something like this, today's meme or something like that.
Well, I thought FOMO was so 2013. It's now JOMO, which is the joy of missing out. Now people are actually seeking opportunities to not participate in things, which I can kind of relate to because I don't know if you feel this way, but there are a lot of times, well, I don't know if it's about missing out, but I was reading an article earlier today about how people don't want to get on the phone anymore, and that we're all so used to texting that we kind of fear and try and avoid actual voice-to-voice conversations. And I feel like that avoidance of certain types of previously super common experiences, like, I don't know, face-to-face contact or voice-to-voice discussion, going out into the physical world and having an experience, those seem to be things we now just kind of are starting to feel uncomfortable with, where it's like, I'll pass. It's joy of missing out, but now it's a little bit too extreme.
Do you think that because we are moving or are in that realm, the joy of missing out, that most of us are spending too much time in front of screens? Yeah,
it's almost like that's replaced, in a way, because screens are what's right in front of our eyes. That's the world now, because that's what's always in front of our eyes instead of walking outside and seeing stuff in front of us. I do this all the time. A lot of people do it, where even when you're walking outside, you're not looking at anything. When you're in the car, you're not looking at anything outside the car. You're looking at your screen. Yeah. When you're in the train, you're looking at your screen. So really 90% of the day is me looking at my screen. And it does have an effect on you because you're not connected anymore to what's going on around you, and you're not really seeking that out anymore either, because I feel like we've become really habituated to our screens to a bit of a detrimental effect.
Yeah. And we don't know yet, I guess, what the long-term effects of all these screens are around us, except for the fact that they, I guess, create a lot of anxiety. But the point of screens and what we wanted to talk about on this particular episode, we're starting to see a lot more content delivered directly to apps rather than those apps just being used as a distribution platform. Companies are developing for those apps in particular. One example was, I guess had shared with me, was a Los Angeles Times article on how news companies are using Snapchat to actually create content within Snapchat, whereas in the past they may have created that and then cut it up or edited it to fit Snapchat. They're actually making that content specifically for those channels. Is this a trend that we're going to continue to see, and why are we going to continue to see it if it is a trend?
I definitely think we will, because like you were just talking about, I feel like there's been an evolution for media companies on digital where, at first they started by just having a presence. They had a website, and then they started having video content to mimic what you would typically see on TV. And then they started trying to distribute that video content. Or actually, I should say they tried to distribute it onto various platforms. But the problem with those platforms is you would have to still search out the original media company in order to see their content. And I think that's actually where a lot of companies, media or non, have kind of stopped in their marketing strategy. Is they've said, okay, well, all we need to do is just keep distributing it out. Yeah. People who like us will look for us on those platforms, and that should be good to go. And I think the slight nuance that we're seeing now, which could actually be really interesting, is it's not, for instance, in the case of this article, it's not like NBC News is just taking NBC News and putting it into Snapchat. Like you said, they're actually designing a Snapchat-specific news program. So the anchors are specific to Snapchat. The format is specific to Snapchat. It's shot in the style that's appropriate for Snapchat. It's at the length of time that makes sense for Snapchat. So they're really building to the platform instead of using the platform as a delivery vehicle. And I think that, and it's also not really dependent on the name NBC, that it has its own program name, Stay Tuned. And I think, this ties into what we're seeing in terms of behavior is, people, it's getting harder and harder, probably because there's so many choices. So it's getting harder and harder to get people out of their kind of preferred trifecta of apps. Everyone kind of uses maybe 4 to 5 apps max on their phone. It's kind of like brain cells where you only use 10% of what you actually could be using. Most people, because of the need for simplicity, just end up using the same ones over and over. Yeah. And they're not exploring anymore. There's not the newfangled quality of like, ooh, what's going to be in this app? Everyone's just like, they have their Instagram, their Facebook, their Twitter, and that's what they kind of rotate through. And I think, so what we're seeing is it's not the media companies in the past who might have expected that people might seek them out. It's also not enough to just be mobile optimized or be able to be viewed on mobile. You have to actually show up within the right app. And it's not just about being distributed through like a paid media buy, but about really being designed for and organic to the platform that you're serving that up in, so that it makes sense in context that it's like this program belongs in Snapchat because it's been designed there. So yeah, I definitely think, since people are kind of staying in their digital boundaries much more often than in the past when everything was new and we kind of tried new things out, that it's going to force those media companies to play within those specific boundaries. And actually, it'd be smart, if I were a marketing strategist for a company that's trying to exploit that, to not just look at what apps your audience typically uses as a way to, push an ad out onto those apps to get in front of their eyes, but start designing content, original content for that specific platform, so that it makes a lot more sense in context and isn't just about putting an ad on top of the content that's already kind of naturally there.
I think one of the things that's also interesting is it follows a behavior that most developers have been used to for a long time, which is if I'm going to develop an app within the iOS or Android ecosystem, it has to follow certain guidelines. Now content creators almost are taking that behavior. Hey, instead of just making content and then cutting it up and then pushing it out to various platforms. It's like, no, this has to fit the specifications of that platform. You wouldn't just take a picture and put it up on Instagram, with a bunch of people who are like, posed in a particular way. You'd probably want to have an outward facing photo because people are interested in looking at, what you're seeing through your eyes. In some respects, that's the experiential nature of it. If you're putting something up on Pinterest, you want it so that people can pass it along and get some interesting advice from it, but it's very visual, since visual search is such a big part of that. Like, I think finally content creators are understanding, how to fit within specific platforms rather than, no, we'll just make it one way. It'll fit across the web, and then we'll just put it within each channel. I mean, you and I know, right, Cheryl, that just has not worked for the last 10 years. If you were early on in Facebook, the biggest problem were companies that would say, hey, we did video. This video is really meant for our website, but is there any way that we can share it on Facebook? Right. And you're like, no one's going to really want to watch this. It's an ad. Right. And people were like, well, we don't care.
Well, I think it also goes to a deeper question of brand too, because, brands used to mean consistency, a high degree of consistency. And so you have your video and it has a certain branded tone and design and voice and all of the brand elements in it. And that doesn't work anymore when you have to design so much to the platform. So I think it'll be interesting to see brands try and adapt by thinking more about what they represent from a value perspective, from a service perspective, some of those intangibles that are now becoming the actual crux of a brand. So it used to be message, it used to be brand identity, and now it's really more like, what are the values you stand for? What are the experiences you create? And what are the what beliefs do you have? And there was a fourth one that I was mentioning that I've just blanked on. But I feel like those are the things that can carry through consistently in a world where you have to design the actual look and feel of the content to the platform. But, you mentioned screens at the beginning of the podcast. And I think another side to this, which we were kind of touching on with JOMO and FOMO, I saw this really interesting article from The Atlantic, actually. And it had this provocative title called "Have Smartphones Destroyed a Generation?" It was very interesting because
the answer to that, what it should just say is, "Have smartphones destroyed a generation?" The article is just one word. Yes. No, I'm kidding.
Well, it's funny because on the one hand, every generation has had this, or at least in the 20th and 21st century. It's like, well, television is going to destroy everything. Yes. Radio is going to destroy everything. So, I mean, we do know rock and roll was going to destroy
everything. Hip hop was going to destroy everything. Punk rock. Oh, yeah.
Whatever the disruptive force was, it was going to destroy everything. So, I mean, I started reading this article with a bit of a grain of salt, but he made some interesting points, the author, because he was talking about how behaviorally, like Gen Xers, for instance, they were the first to extend or to delay adulthood as long as they did compared to previous generations. Yep. So delaying adulthood, which people usually talk about with millennials now and with this new generation called iGen, that's not a new thing. But there are things that are completely new. And that was what was really interesting is he talks about how because of the smartphone dominating every element of their lives, they've really fundamentally changed their values and their attitudes. So for instance, he said teens used to be defined by independence-seeking behavior. So they would kind of want to push boundaries. They would want to be going away from the home, doing things that basically gave them the sense that they're achieving independence or becoming more of an adult. And he noted that at least in this research of kids who were born between like 1997 and I think they have 2007, 2011. 2012 is the most recent year they include in this generation. He found that these young people are not seeking to leave the home. In fact, they're spending more and more of their time alone in their bedrooms, suffering from more mental health problems than previous generations of that same age. I mean, we all know teens are angsty, but part of the reason is because they're alone in their rooms and they're only consuming their social content and what they're seeing on their iPhones. So they're not really gaining some of the behaviors that you learn, coping behaviors, socialization behaviors. He noted, for instance, they're dating less. They're not getting their driver's licenses. They don't need to do things anymore for themselves because iPhones deliver everything. It's like, you don't need to go outside for food. You don't need to go outside. You don't need to learn to drive. You pretty much don't need to learn how to do anything because you can just get it all through your phone. But it got us, talking before we started the podcast about, how screens have this anxious impact on us. And we talked at the beginning of the podcast about that too, that you kind of, you're hyper aware of how you look and how people perceive you.
Oh yeah.
There's this onslaught of media and messages and notifications, and it's very anxiety inducing. And I think it's interesting with that context, we're also seeing kind of the antidote to that is this retreat into nostalgia. So I know we were talking about media companies, and that's another interesting trend I think we're seeing with media companies is they're starting to kind of dig back through 1970s, 1990s era content, TV shows, movies, and those are now getting rebooted for our generation. Probably because we have a lot of upheaval, social upheaval and angst that kind of mirrors the 70s, for instance. But what do you think about the sort of trend in nostalgia content, whether it's on Netflix or in the movie theaters?
I think it's following a similar path that anxiety-driven, that basically we have with smartphone anxious-driven behavior. Notifications and constantly getting messages and constantly getting buzzes in your pocket force you to constantly look at your phone, so you're really paying more attention to that world than the world around you. And it can be very hard to sort of pay attention. I mean, you've even seen videos where they show people who are watching their phones and they cross into the street and get hit by a car and fall into a manhole cover that's open.
That's going to be me someday.
Crazy stuff. The throwback era, the nostalgia, that's always existed, but it's becoming more commonplace because it ties into a psychological study that nostalgia makes people feel good. And because people are so anxious, the creators realize, let's make people feel good again. And the way you do that is through nostalgia. I mean, when you get together with friends and you reminisce, it actually makes you feel good. In fact, psychologists say you should do that every so often. It's actually good to reminisce about the past, things where you're like, man, I remember when that happened and that was so funny, or that really was just such a great time, because it makes you feel good. It releases a lot of dopamine into your brain. This is exactly why I think the nostalgia thing is happening. I think content creators realize, let's take advantage of the fact that we have just an anxiety-driven population now, and it gets them to say, wow, I remember this. Now, of course, some purists are quick to say, I can't believe they're rebooting that. Why would they ever do that? But a majority of the new generation doesn't remember when that was out. Only the people who actually lived through it the first time. And many of those people will go again because that brings out that nostalgia. And I think we always have seen every 20 years, we're repeating what happened 20 years prior. I had posted on LinkedIn recently that if you really want to know where we are right now, you just have to look to 20 years ago in 1997, and you almost can see a lot of things that emerged then are happening now. For example, Woolworth, which was a big retailer, went out of business in 1997. Retail is changing radically right now because of lots of changes. Napster and the whole music industry sort of emerged, or what we knew of MP3 technology. We now know that streaming services have totally changed where we are with music, and that's probably going to happen again. The fact that AOL chat boards were so big, when people are like, social media is massive now, and it's such a, huge mainstream phenomena. It was on the fringe 20 years ago, and it was big with a core group of people who were online. So none of this is new. We constantly are trying to, I think, borrow from past eras. But I think in this time, Cheryl, and for the sort of emerging future and what we have to watch as we evolve is this being done to basically, get people to feel happy, knowing that we just live in uncertain times? But you could also say that we've lived in uncertain times forever, because we don't have any way to predict the future. And I think anybody who, again, says they do, they're just basically trying to sell you snake oil.
True. Well, and I do feel like humans have always tried in various ways to predict and to anticipate and to control the things that they can't control. That's definitely for sure. But I do think we're living in a uniquely complex and difficult time, because we've never had this much stimuli thrown at us all at once, this much conflict thrown at us all at once. The nature of technology has made everything closer together. And so conflict is closer together. All of the things that, all cultural, economic, political, everything is more immediate and constant because of technology. And so I definitely think as a people, we're reaching a level of anxiety that has not been felt perhaps since the Middle Ages, potentially. I mean, the Black Death was probably not a great time to be alive. So I'll give it to the 14th century. But it's interesting too, because, while we're seeing nostalgia content, like Stranger Things, or I was noticing recently game shows are starting to come back on, ABC, or Love Connection is coming back. All of these from the 70s, 80s, 90s, as they're starting to have this resurgence. That sort of addresses our anxiety in a positive way. It's giving us a simple escape. To your point about nostalgia, we always look back and see the past more simply and more positively than it actually was. On the flip side, though, we're also starting to see this surge of media that's actually just kind of building off of our anxiety. So there are two examples that I saw of just today that actually is getting a reboot now with Bruce Willis. And there's been a lot of pushback already, a lot of criticism saying that it feels very alt-right in the story and the values that it's kind of conveying. And it feels very much like it's a movie that's interestingly timely, considering all of the discussions that have been happening now, but in a way that makes people very uncomfortable.
Yeah, it'll be interesting.
The same way that Death Wish originally made people uncomfortable.
It did, and that's the interesting thing is people will not remember. They'll only remember the nostalgia of things being made, but not the controversy of what happened in those times. And I think you brought that point up, Cheryl, and it's a good one to make, which is things are always simple the second time around, but people didn't realize, or probably don't realize, when that movie was released in the late 70s, there was major controversy around that. Everyone was like, oh my goodness, what's going on? How dare there be this vigilante scene in here with this particular person? There were racist overtones in the movie. There were tons of things that happened, but they'll just remember like, oh yeah, that was a badass film when it came out.
Right.
Almost like when I'm watching the CNN special on the 90s right now, and everyone who didn't live through that era, and many of them voted in the most recent election, were like, that was a great era. We need a certain person to be elected president. Right. And then and it's like you watch this and you're like, that era sucked. There were so many issues in that era. I mean, not that anyone's going to repeat that era if they had, become president. But there was just a lot of things that I just realized. I was like, the recession was terrible. I slept in my parents' basement for like 3 years after I graduated from college. Like, there was just not really much opportunity. You had the whole slacker generation, that basically was that term was given to Gen X, which, of course, then everyone says, oh, millennials are, the same way, and Gen Z is the same way. I think everything reverberates itself. And we're just in this sort of cycle loop. And you could almost go back to when our parents were young. They probably had terms for them as well, which basically were older people saying, what a bunch of losers, young people are. I mean,
the only thing I think has changed, though, is media consumption, because, that really is such a recent thing. And I think you're right that it is easier for us to replicate every 20 years, the 20 years before us, because we have frames of reference thanks to the media. but I don't know that it necessarily goes back, like were the 1340s a ripoff of the 1320s? Probably not. They probably were pretty much the same because they didn't have as much change to have to deal with. So for hundreds of years, society wasn't really changing that much. Whereas now, every single year, every single month, something is changing. So I think we have more of a need to kind of slow time down by going backwards periodically. But speaking of going backwards periodically, and the media that's kind of building off of our anxiety, it's not just Death Wish that came out. I also saw this new movie trailer for Bushwick. Such a perfectly flawed looking movie. And it's in Bushwick, which, people who live in New York will know is now a almost fully gentrified hipster neighborhood, which only a couple of years ago was not the case. So, of course, that's now the focal point of this movie, which is an apocalyptic movie, essentially. It's about a civil war happening in the United States. And I thought it was interesting because when I started looking at Death Wish and this apocalyptic Bushwick movie, I was doing a search for apocalyptic films from the 70s, which of course are not 20 years ago, but 90 years ago. And a lot of people remember there were actually...
Wait, not 90 years ago, 40 years ago.
Sorry, 40 instead of the 90s, which is 20 years ago.
Yes,
That's what I meant to say.
Just to clarify,
Sorry for anyone born in the 70s. I didn't mean that you're in the 90s. No, but there was a spate of apocalyptic films throughout that decade. All the 70s, or throughout the 70s, there were an endless number of famous apocalyptic films, post-apocalyptic films, I should say, including, of course, Planet of the Apes, but Soylent Green, lots of them.
Apocalypse Now. I mean, you had a whole film that basically used the term apocalypse, in it. Apocalypse Now, which is a wonderful film. I mean, in the sense of cinema. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and so I feel like we're seeing that resurgence again because the times are so anxious and because the energy is feeling the same, which is basically all to say that we are influenced by our media and our media is influenced by us. And our media is really a reflection of our psychology. But what we're seeing in the screen era that we live in is our psychology is now a reflection of the screens. And I think that that's, it's now going in both directions. So we'll have to see where that leads us ultimately.
Absolutely, because again, we don't know what the post-screen era will look like because we don't know what those devices will look like. We don't know what technology, how it will behave. We don't know how we'll interact with it. That's why, again, looking at the future can be exciting and at the same time can make us very anxious. For another episode, I am Jeffrey Colon.
And I'm Cheryl Metzger.
And we'll catch you next time. Disruptive FM is brought to you by Branding Strategy Insider. Read all about branding in the 21st century and how to adapt in an era of disruption. Check out brandingstrategyinsider.com.
You've been listening to an episode of Disruptive FM, the marketing podcast for eccentric minds. Rate and review the show on iTunes. Purchase a copy of Jeffrey's book, Disruptive Marketing, and follow us on Twitter at Disruptive FM. Signing off from the cities of Chicago and Seattle, press pause.
Disrupt the system, jam the transmission.